A sober friend of mine called me and she said, "Where are you?" Right away, that doesn't feel like good news. And I said, "I'm home. What's the matter? I'm coming over to your apartment. Please don't leave. I'll be there in 30 minutes." She had 9 years sober. I had 1 year sober. She sat down on my couch. She put her hand on my forearm and she said, "Bobby's dead. He jumped out of his eighth-story window." That is a long answer to your question, but this was the beginning of my recovery. What I learned in that moment is that if I touch drugs and alcohol ever again, I'm dead. That addiction does not discriminate. It doesn't care if you have 50 days or 50 years. When you become spiritually unfit, it can smell your vulnerability and it is waiting for you to pounce.
Welcome to Linda's Corner, where we bring more hope, healing, and happiness to the world. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about living sober and updating the 12-step addiction recovery program. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Samantha Harte. Dr. Harte is a mental health expert, physical therapist, author, performing artist, podcast host, and sober mom of two. You can learn about Dr. Harte and her new book, Breaking the Circuit, at her website, drsamanthaharte.com, and I'll include that link in the show notes. Welcome. I'm so glad that you could join with me today, Samantha.
Thank you so much. As I said earlier, this is truly my most favorite thing to do, which is talk honestly about what's, I think we are hardwired for it and also starving for it right now.
Ooh, so
It's
we're
my pleasure
hardwired to talk openly, or we're
to connect.
to connect. So the connection, yeah, we need that connection. And to be able to get to that point where it touches our hearts. And it's interesting, as we were chatting before, and you said, I love to talk about matters of the heart, when here we're talking about addiction recovery. And so it is part of our heart. It is part of who we are. And that feeling of not being in control of yourself and who you are is, I imagine, so frustrating and overwhelming. And we have different experiences. I've had challenges that I've had to overcome, and addiction isn't one of them. I've only actually been to one 12-step meeting to support a friend, and they called me a normie. They said, normies are weird. We don't understand you. So I'm so glad that there's someone here that can understand what people are going through, because I think part of the process of healing is recognizing I'm not alone. And so to have someone who has been there and is honest and open and vulnerable enough to say, you know what? I'm not perfect. And here's what I've gone through. And here's how I came out of it. So is it okay if we start with your story, and then we'll get into what didn't work and why and what does?
Sure. Yeah. A little backstory first is the environment I grew up in, which was in Brooklyn, New York, was just very chaotic. And so if we took a snapshot inside of my home when I was in early adolescence, my parents were married, but very unhappily. And the power dynamic between them was such that whatever my mother said ruled, but it wasn't always that way. So my father had had enough offenses against him that by the time I really remember the way things were, he had been assigned to the basement. So he was physically absent in many ways and completely emotionally absent. Not because he didn't love us, but because he didn't have the capacity. And I think he felt sentenced to the basement. So everything my mother said stuck and landed in my nervous system in a way that created who I was to become. And what I mean by that is not only was she having an extramarital affair that I knew all about. So if somebody pissed you off, you could go ahead and get some revenge. That was a lesson I learned. And also the abuse of prescription pills, which was highly normalized in my house. And then I had an older sister who was experimenting with drugs and sex with all the genders. And so I was hyper exposed at an early age to things that I should have never seen. And on top of that, I was very good in school. And even though I loved to dance and I really saw a future in the entertainment industry, my mom really wanted me to get a degree. And I went ahead and did what I thought I was supposed to do and went away to college, the same place my sister went, was getting a degree in communications because it felt wide enough for me to fit inside of, knowing full well it meant nothing to me. And then I'm not going to go into this part of my story, but it's in my book. I left Boston University after my second year, and I took that as an opportunity to move into Manhattan and start auditioning. And it was really at that time that I was confronted with this big new world and all the possibilities. And at the same time, I was convinced that I could control everything. I had always been able to, if it was outside of me, my grades, my body, the boyfriend I was with. So I started bartending to pay my rent. I was taking some classes. I was finishing my undergraduate degree. I was dabbling in the entertainment world, auditioning, but my drinking picked up a lot. And all other times prior to this point in my life, I had been able to start and stop. It really felt like drinking and experimenting with drugs was just a thing I could completely control, like everything else in my life. And then I got introduced to cocaine as a bartender, also thinking full well, there's no way this will ever get out of control. And all the while, as that's picking up, I really don't have the inner resilience to handle the rejection of the entertainment industry. Every no was crushing to me. And so I really fell back on what was safe and comfortable, which was school, because talk about a highly controlled environment. If you do X, Y, and Z, you will get an A. If you take enough of these classes, you will get a degree. If this, then that. And boy, does a perfectionist love that formula. So I went to school, I got my degree, and then I thought, well, communications isn't going to cut it. Not only does it not feel right for me, it doesn't feel prestigious enough for me or my mother. What if I had doctor in front of my name? And then physical therapy was born, this idea that I could have a career that maybe included the arts and entertainment. Maybe I could be a PT for the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, which is a place I had been teaching dance at in Manhattan when I was living there. So it felt like it cast a really wide net for me. So I studied and I studied and I studied and I bartended and I bartended and I drank and I used and then I put it down and then I got A's. And I was this really, really high functioning addict. And eventually I got my acceptance letter into the graduate school of my dreams. And I knew exactly how I was going to celebrate. Work hard, play hard. It was time to play. I called the only other woman in my life at the time that partied as hard as I did, but she wasn't really a friend. I had met her once. We called the cocaine dealer at 2 p.m. It was Christmas time in the city. We did cocaine all day, hopped around from shop to shop, from bar to bar, drinking Coronas, leveling out, and then snorting more lines. And when I got back to my apartment at around 7 p.m., I started to feel off. Couldn't quite put my finger on it, like my brain was foggy. So I went into the bedroom to go rest, reached for the remote. And the next thing I remember is laying on my side on the floor my gaze was horizontal, and my friend was hovering over me on the phone. So as my gaze shifted vertically and I looked at her, she was on the phone with 911 trying to figure out where I lived. So I knew immediately that something awful must have happened. And shame swept over me because the next day was Christmas Eve. And I thought, whatever just happened, nobody can know. I said, get off the phone. I'm fine. We'll call our mutual friend. We'll have her come over. Everything's okay. Get off the phone. So she did. And I found out that I had overdosed. So I started seizuring and convulsing on the floor. And she was trying to get me from my back to my side to pull my tongue out of my throat so I wouldn't choke. And then she called 911, but she was so high and we weren't really friends that she didn't know my address. Who knows what the course of my life would have been had I actually gone to the hospital that day, had I been found out, so to speak. You would think that that would be my bottom. To the normie, as you say, that seems pretty damn extreme to spook you sober. And I called the one person that I had met about a year before that. When I was trying to figure out what I was going to do as a career, the other way I was making money was as a personal trainer. I love movement. I'm a dancer. And I had a client named Bobby. Bobby was 22 years sober from heroin addiction. He grew up in Hell's Kitchen. He was kind of rough and tough and this big, bright, beautiful specimen, just so much energy and light in his eyes. And he was the one I thought about after that overdose. I thought I could call him and he wouldn't judge me. So I did. I said, I think I might have a problem. Something really scary happened and I don't feel like I can tell anybody except for you. And he said, all right, let's go to a meeting. Went to a meeting, sat in the back of those 12-step rooms, crossed my arms, and said, no way. I do not relate. This sounds religious. This sounds like a cult. I don't look like you. I don't drink like you. I'm not you. And I don't need this. I just have a little tiny problem right over here that I need to figure out and learn how to control. But all this stuff you're telling me I'm going to need to do forever? No, thanks. Not for me. So I didn't go back for a year and a half. And the guy I was with at the time was my boyfriend. And, my using had become pretty severe. And the lying and the cheating and the ways in which an addict will do what they need to do to get what they need is pretty extensive and damaging to themselves and to the people around them. And so this prescription pill bottle, because I had been clever enough to switch my uppers for downers so I wouldn't overdose maybe as quickly or ever. So I was just smoking a ton of weed and taking a lot of benzodiazepines like Xanax. So this prescription pill bottle that my father had been supplying for me because he was the enabler in the family dynamic, because this is very much a family dysfunction with very deep roots. This guy I was dating found the bottle and he looked at me with disgust in his eyes. And I knew if I did not do something, he was going to leave. And the idea of him leaving represented the end of me. That is how little self-worth I had. And it was unimaginable to me, the idea of him leaving. And I thought, I got to call Bobby again. Here we go. Bobby, I think I need to go to another meeting. All right, kid, let's go. And nothing changed for me. I sat in the back, I crossed my arms, and I othered myself to death. I didn't look like you. I didn't drink like you. I didn't use like you. I still have the grades and the boyfriend and the body, and I am going to be a doctor. What am I doing here? And by the way, I was taught that there is no such thing as God and that the only person you can count on is yourself. That narrative lived in my nervous system. So the idea of God as a way forward was threatening to me. But I was told, you're going to have to figure that out if you want to live a sober life. But in the meantime, I was so afraid of losing my boyfriend that I just said, Bobby, I don't trust this program. I don't trust anybody, but I trust you and I believe you. I believe that you figured something out about how to live, and I want to learn whatever that is. So he took me all over the city. He took me to meeting after meeting after meeting. We went through the steps very quickly. He knew I hated the idea of God. I wasn't the only one in a 12-step program who hated the idea of God. And he just said, you can borrow my faith until you have some of your own. So I did. I wouldn't say I was the happiest and most pleasant person. And if anybody listening has ever tried to be sober without new tools in the toolbox, let's remember that even though addiction becomes the problem itself, it begins as the solution to the problem.
Absolutely.
And the problem is pain. Pain about what is going on between our ears, pain about our childhood trauma, pain about the way we speak to ourselves, the way we think of ourselves. And when you don't replace that voice in your head with something kinder and more loving and more compassionate, you are arguably a worse version of yourself in early recovery. So I was no piece of cake. I was without drugs and alcohol, nothing to anesthetize my pain, and just hanging on by a thread. But Bobby got a real kick out of me, and he got it. He knew I was just an angry newcomer, and he loved me. And towards the end of that first year, I had had a couple of breakthroughs, a couple of emotional breakthroughs, realizing how hard I was on myself. So no wonder I needed to drink and use. My inner critic became so unrelenting that first year sober. So I had made a start, but just a small one. And then Bobby started acting different, pulling away a little bit, not as warm, not as bright, couldn't quite put my finger on it. And at this point, I was well into grad school and I got this opportunity to go to California for 8 weeks and work out of Cedars-Sinai. And it was perfect because that boyfriend who caught that bottle of pills, he was still with me and he kind of wanted to move to LA. And I thought, well, let me try this out. Let me see. It's a place where there's dance and entertainment, and I can also do physical therapy. So I got out there and I said, hey, Bobby, let's just go back to being friends. I'm going to get a temporary sponsor. I don't know what's going on with you, but I don't want to lose our friendship because we were friends before we were sponsor and sponsee. And then I couldn't get a hold of him. Every time I would take a dance class and something amazing would happen, I would finally get picked. The choreographer would notice me. I would get asked to be in a show. And I wanted to share this amazing stuff that felt like in part it was happening because I was living a sober life and I had him to thank for it. And he didn't pick up. I was like, man, is this guy really taking this personally all his time sober? And he can't get over the fact that I put a pin in that part of our relationship so we could like just making up stories in my head, you know? And finally his wife picked up and she said, Bobby relapsed. That's why you haven't heard from him. Please stop calling. He's not doing well. Maybe you can see him when you get back to New York. That phone call was so shocking to me. I knew nothing about addiction at that time. Nothing. the way that I know it now. I couldn't wait to get back and meet up with him and just find out what happened and get his side of the story. Maybe it wasn't that. Maybe I don't know. Please tell me something. So we met up and everything he said was without eye contact and it was an excuse. And I was so confused. Bobby, did you relapse or not? I don't understand. How could you relapse? You're the one that's not supposed to relapse. You're the one who's letting me know I can do this and I'm barely hanging on. What happened? I wanted to study what happened so as to never repeat it myself. And he couldn't give me a straight answer. He had had a shoulder surgery. He had gotten a staph infection. They gave him Oxycontin. That's where he stopped that part of the story. And then he said, my wife is driving me insane. I'm miserable. I want a divorce. Just excuses. And I think the most profound thing in that moment was that the light in his eyes was out. And it spooked me the way I would get spooked as a young girl when my mom, who was emotionally volatile my whole life, mentally unstable, but a firecracker, after she would take her prescription pills at night, everything was muted. It was the same feeling, like the light had gone out in her eyes. And here I was in front of Bobby, and I was experiencing the same thing, which I equate to being in the presence of a ghost. And that is being around somebody whose body is physically alive, but whose essence, the thing that makes them quintessentially who they are, is dead. It's a really frightening experience. And he asked me to help him clean his apartment because he was in a sling and he knew I was about to be a physical therapist. He paid me to keep him company. And I did that one time. And I just remember feeling so uncomfortable that I thought, I can't, this is too hard for me, that I need some distance until hopefully he gets more time sober again or something. I didn't tell him that directly, but I knew that I needed it. And 2 weeks later, a sober friend of mine called me and she said, where are you? Right away, that doesn't feel like good news. And I said, I'm home. What's the matter? I'm coming over to your apartment. Please don't leave. I'll be there in 30 minutes. She had 9 years sober. I had 1 year sober. She sat down on my couch. She put her hand on my forearm and she said, Bobby's dead. He jumped out of his 8th-story window. That is a long answer to your question, but this was the beginning of my recovery. What I learned in that moment is that if I touch drugs and alcohol ever again, I'm dead. That addiction does not discriminate. It doesn't care if you have 50 days or 50 years. When you become spiritually unfit, it can smell your vulnerability and it is waiting for you to pounce. But I also knew in that moment that I hated the language of the 12 steps. And I wasn't just in my ego, kicking and screaming, not wanting to do the work. And that's the thing. The program is brilliant, but it was formed a long time ago. And we know a lot more now. So now, 15 years in recovery, speaking to you on this podcast, what we know, what I know about childhood trauma, addiction, psychology, makes me understand that the language of the steps, which for the next 4 years after he died, I could not get behind, was butting up against deeply ingrained childhood beliefs that had kept me safe. I felt threatened by those steps. And so I spent the next few years knowing I couldn't drink, knowing I couldn't use, because I wasn't ready to die, but I had no idea how to live any other way than the way I always had, which was to control everyone and everything and make sure that everything outside of me was shiny and pretty and perfect so that I could be okay inside. And when I say perfectionism, among other things, collapses in matters of the heart, I mean it. My real recovery did not begin until 5 years sober when my marriage was falling apart because the guy that was my boyfriend who found those pills became my fiance and became my husband. He stayed with me despite all my destructive behavior. And then he started to pull away in my early sobriety and in our early marriage, emotionally, physically absent, like my dad was growing up. And the more he pulled away, the more I gripped, begging, pleading, will you go to therapy? Will you go to Al Anon, the other 12-step program for the people who love the addict, who are angry? Please, for the love of God, we have to heal. We didn't get this far and get married for you to hate me. And the more I begged, the more he recoiled. All the things I had ever learned how to do to get what I needed weren't working. Our fighting became so frequent, not physical, verbal, and so severe that I was filled with a really nasty combination of anxiety and rage every day. He would go on trips for extended periods of time. He would leave his wedding ring. I would come home and look him in the eye and say, I know you're cheating on me. Just tell me. Make this stop. This doesn't make sense. You married me anyway. I don't know what you're talking about. You're the one who cheated. You're the one who did this. So as my intuition was trying to say, something doesn't smell right here, the part of me that learned not to trust it my whole life, to self-abandon, to make sure everyone in my house was okay, we could all maybe try to get along for 5 minutes, was overriding my intuition and saying, this probably is your fault, Sam. You cheated on him so many times. You lost count. And maybe this is just how it's going to look for a while because you guys didn't go to therapy before you got married. You didn't do the healing work you both really needed to do before you got married. So it's maybe just going to look messy. And the fighting was so crazy for me that I had enough sobriety to know I needed to get out of that house, even though I didn't want to get out of the marriage. And that looked like couch surfing in multiple people's places for several months. And the details of that are in my book. So I will not go into them, but I will tell you that what it led to was me finally signing a lease after 8 months of couch surfing in my own place as a 30-year-old woman with 5 years sober. This was when I hit bottom, not when I overdosed on cocaine 5 years earlier, not when Bobby died, when my marriage fell apart, when I realized that the only faith I had was faith in things outside of me to make me feel safe and whole in the world. And it didn't work. And if I didn't figure something else out that was birthed from inside of me, I was probably going to relapse and I was probably going to die. That was bottom. Spiritual rock bottom. That was when the right person walked into my life at the right time and said, what if we do the steps on your marriage? What do you mean? That sounds really interesting to me. Well, instead of I'm powerless over alcohol or cocaine and my life is unmanageable, I'm powerless over my marriage, over the history of it, over the future of it, over all my hopes and dreams of what I thought it was going to look like that are now dying in real time, over whether my husband will ever forgive me, over whether he's actually cheating on me. I'm powerless over so many things. And when I try to exert power over it, over him, begging him to go to therapy, 12 step, to forgive me, to tell me the truth, my life becomes unmanageable in the following ways. I have no peace. I have no access to real power, the power that can come from inside of me to think about it differently, to make new choices, to self-soothe. And I have no sense of worthiness. And we went through the steps like that. The defining moment where I forged my own sense of faith was at the 9th step. So in recovery, that's making an amends. And now I was 5 years sober. I had made many amends, but they were always to someone else. Because after all, addicts, in the end, are quite destructive to the people around them. But they are also destructive to themselves. And she was the first person in my life who said, have you ever made an amends to yourself? I know not of what you speak. As a perfectionist, it never even occurred to me that that was a possibility. I was run by my inner critic. The never enoughness felt like its own addiction to keep me hustling for that thing over there outside of me that was going to make me all right. And then I'd get it. And that wasn't enough either. So, of course, it didn't occur to me to say, hey, you know what, Samantha? You did make a lot of bad choices with this man. In fact, you are a good person who happened to make bad choices. How do you want to live? Do you want to live in a perpetual state of low self-esteem and chronic anxiety? Or do you want to learn to love yourself for the first time? That is when everything started to change. That is when I had a vehicle to clear my shame, which everything had gotten thrown on. You know, addicts are filled with shame that stems back from when they were little. And in order to cover up the shame, we put everything on top of it that we can. Drugs, alcohol, sex, any dopamine hit we can find. Even self-laceration covers it up. So now I was peeling it all back finding a way to clear the shame by speaking to myself more compassionately. And by the way, it is a practice. It is not linear. It is not as if I waved a wand and said, "You, Samantha, are forgiven." And all of a sudden I had healthy, loving self talk. No, this is where the science of real change comes in. It is a practice. It is bumpy. It is messy. But if you stay the course, if you interrupt constantly through mindfulness, the negative self talk and say, what would a kinder version of what I just said to myself sound like? You start to heal. And then I could hear the whisper of my intuition. Finally, that relationship back home to my highest self has been nurtured and strengthened over the last decade of my recovery through hell and high water, because I've lived through quite a bit more since then. I now comfortably call that God. I have no more issue saying the word God. It's not religious at all to me. It's not a Christian punishing God. It's not man-made. It's not, there's no such thing. You're a fool if you believe it. It's when I tap into the highest version of myself, which I believe every one of us has, and it gets covered up by what the world does to us, by what we see in our homes, by cultural conditioning. It just gets covered up. And if you're on a healing journey, you're just on one giant journey back to that relationship with yourself, the highest, most loving, most compassionate, most authentic version of who you are. And that is the God that I believe is inside of all of us. And when I line up my intellect, my God-given intellect, with my heart and my intuition, when those three things are stacked like blocks of Legos, it feels like the inspiration I get from the bottom up and from the top down is clear. I always know it's my intuition when it's clear, calm, compassionate, and curious. When it's my critic trying to sit in the seat of CEO, it's loud, it's ruminating, it's obsessive. I have to figure it out. I'm usually Google searching. I usually feel a chronic pit of anxiety in my stomach. I mean, I physically feel contracted, whereas my intuitive voice feels expansive. It's the difference of being in a sympathetic state, fight or flight, or a parasympathetic state, right? Rest and digest.
Right.
My whole life is built around what my intuition has to say at any given moment, regardless of whether something is big or small. And my book is a modern and trauma informed reinvention of the steps, not just because as a doctor, I've seen the importance again and again on a soul level of meeting people where they're at for any change to take place and not just judging why they're acting the way that they are. We are in such a divisive time. We have lost our ability to communicate and hold space for each other and get to the root of people's suffering, because it means we have to look at our own, which is scary. So not just as a doctor, but my lived experience is such that my life did not change until I worked those steps in a new way. And I believe in my bones that anyone, addict or not, because remember, in sobriety, I was deeply suffering from perfectionism, from untreated perfectionism. And it was killing my spirit. There are hundreds of thousands of people that can relate to that. And those steps, when you take out the religious connotation and you freshen up the language to make it current with what the research has taught us, they can help anybody. Suffering through anything, big or small. I am on a mission. I did not just write a book. I believe I've started a movement, and I am filled with so much purpose for the pain I've lived through and so much passion. And as I said to you, there is really nothing every 24 hours that is more important to me than accessing joy and truthfulness. Those two things. If I get both in one day, whoo,
That's a good day.
it was a good day.
Wow. Samantha, this has been an amazing ride going with you on this journey, and to be able to listen and to be able to experience secondhand. And isn't it beautiful that the answers really are inside of us?
Hmm.
And at the most basic level, it is, am I worthy of love? Am I worthy of love? And do I love myself? And sometimes the answer is no, because I don't think I'm worthy of love. And so as we work on that, I am lovable. I am worthy and deserving of love. And that's not something we control from the outside. It's something we work on the inside. And I'm so grateful that you were able to find it.
Hmm.
And I'm sorry about Bobby, that he did the work but didn't make that inside connection of I am worthy. I am worthy of love. Oh, Samantha, thank you. This has been amazing. Is there anything that you want to make sure we cover before we close today?
Uh, there's, I'm going to let it be a cliffhanger as far as why am I doing what I'm doing now? How did I start to write my book? What was the catalyzing moment, right? I had been a PT exclusively for 10 years, and something happened 2 years ago that made me stop everything and write and realize that I needed to make sure I could bring all of who I am into places and spaces. I'm a great clinician, but I am way more than that. And this book and the doors that it is opening for me to speak on stages about the science of real change and the soulfulness of my lived experience is incredible to me. The amount of creative things that have come flooding back into my life, the things I wanted when I was 20, living in New York City, doing a lot of cocaine. I went on tour last year as a choreographer in Japan, a 5-city tour, 40 years old with 2 kids at home. You could have never told me that was going to be possible. My life is extraordinary today, but what got me here is so hard and so painful. And I am on a mission to speak honestly and openly about my lived experience, my hardest things, my most shameful things, because I'm on the other side of them now. And I want to make sure that I shine a light on all of it so that other people feel less alone and hopefully feel like there is a way forward in clearing their own shame, which I believe is the most corrosive thing that we carry in our bodies and in our lives. And so for the person listening who is stuck in that place, I want you to know, no matter what bad choices you've made, you are not a bad person. And I'm proud of you. And you are worthy of love, connection, and belonging.
That's beautiful. And if that message will get into people's souls and they know that you can accept them where they are. And that makes all the difference. Thank you, Samantha. This has been beautiful. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote by Mahatma Gandhi. He said, "As human beings, our greatness lies not so much in being able to remake the world as to being able to remake ourselves." Today, I invite our listeners to turn our pain into power and remake ourselves. See you next time on Linda's Corner.
Thanks for listening. Please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. And if you'd like to heal your life from the inside out, there is a free video series at hopeforhealingfoundation.org. Just click on the Free Stuff tab. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, and You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.